I was born in Rotherhithe in December 1925. Second child, I had an elder sister. I don't quite remember where we lived. Obviously, we had a room where I ate, but the most vivid memory I have of those days is coming out of the house and walking down the road. I was only about 2.5, knocking at a door and going down to see Granny May. Now, Granny May was an elderly lady who lived in our road, and I would knock at her door and she would take me upstairs, sit me at her table, and I would have part of her dinner. And when I had part of her dinner, I used to say, "Thank you very much, goodbye," and I went home again. That's one of the earliest memories I have there. But we moved out of there because it was slum clearance, and they built what was then the new Downham Estate, and we moved into Round Table Road, right opposite Ballamore Road School, and we didn't have any pavements. The pavements hadn't been built then or laid. The paving stones were there, but the building of the roads hadn't begun. And we lived there until about 1938, when my brother would have been old enough to have his own bedroom, and we had to move out of there because we only had 2 bedrooms, and we went to what was then the new Downham Estate on Waters Road, and I lived there until I married. We spent the whole of the war there, of course. I helped my dad do fire watching. I helped put out incendiary bombs. I belonged to the youth club in the Goldsmiths Community Centre. They had a billiard room which had 2 tables, which the girls were not allowed to play on. That was sacrosanct to the boys. They had a beautiful gym, which was run by a man called Mr. Jenkins, who was ex-army. The girls had the usual things. We had needlework and we had dancing. We went camping. We went on hikes. I think if you would tell the kids nowadays that we used to get a bus into Bromley and then walk from Bromley to Down, have lunch, and then walk back again, they'd probably faint. I don't remember my dad talking much about the First World War, apart from the fact that he was in the Royal Artillery. He was on the supply lines, so he would be leading horses, pulling carts of supplies to the front line. I remember once he said that if they came across a dead horse on the field, they had to cover the horse's head because the horse wouldn't pass a dead horse for some reason. Verdant Lane was Verdant Lane. It was a lane. There was a stream running down beside it. There was a pig farm. The lady's father, who owned the pig farm, lived in Killern, opposite the cemetery, which was there then, of course, but the crematorium wasn't. That was allotments in those days. But those shops weren't there. There were 3 little wooden huts, one of which was Mrs. Wilson, and she had a sweet shop. And then we had a grocer's and a greengrocer's, who were both run by Stevens, a PH and a VEN. And we could walk down there on a Sunday, and you could buy sweets and newspapers and what have you. We didn't have any buses. We had to walk. My dad walked from Round Table Road to Grove Park Station to go to work. I walked from where I lived to Durham Hill Road, or to Durham Hill as it was, to go to school. No way did you have a car or a bicycle. You walked. And you came home for lunch and walked back again. In those days, you had twice a day delivery from the milkman. They would come early in the morning to deliver milk, and then later in the day they would come round with things like butter and other goods. The baker could come. You had a baker that came. The coal man delivered. But other things you could go up to the shop and get one egg. You didn't have to buy half a dozen. You could get one egg. Or you could go down to the corn chandler, who is down Sangley Road, and you could get half a pound of something or a quarter of a pound of something. In my mum's day, of course, they would go to the grocery shop and they would get a little screw of paper which had enough for 1 cup of tea in it. We didn't have toilet rolls. Nobody had toilet rolls. We were very, very posh. We had the telephone directories torn up. A bit hard on the bum, but that did its job. When I was growing up, my dad was very, very good to me, because whenever anything was going on in London, Lord Mayor's show, which was always on a Thursday, we always went up there. I always went to work with him on Lord Mayor's show day. He would take me to work. I would sit very quietly in a corner until about 11 o'clock, and then we would go to Ludgate Circus and watch the Lord Mayor's show. Coronation, I would go up, not to see the coronation, but I was taken up at 4 o'clock in the morning of George VI's coronation. I was taken up there to see the parade rehearsal, and that happened at 4 o'clock in the morning. So a very bleary-eyed little girl went up. I was at school until I was 14, and I left school on the day I was 14, because that was 1939, and we didn't have any school. All our schools had been evacuated. I didn't go because I had tonsillitis. Otherwise, I would have been evacuated. In 1939, or from before that, you did what Dad said. If Dad said you were going to work in a factory, you went to work in a factory. I was told when I left school that I would be apprenticed to this embroiderist, because that's where my sister worked. That involved doing badges such as the small badges that you would get on the arms of sailors, denoting what they did, whether they were stokers or signallers or what have you. We also did blazer badges for the Mercer School, which was in London. And the more experienced people did the big cap badge that the army officers or navy officers would wear. If I'd have had any say in it, I would have tried to stay on school, but I wanted to be a nurse, and I never did. We went into work one day. I caught my usual train. I walked from Cannon Street to Aldersgate Street. We went via Cheapside, and you never used the main road. You always went round the little back turnings when you were walking. We passed St Mary Le Beau Church. We walked in front of that, and stepping over firemen's hoses because they were still hosing down the church. And we got into work, and that was the day when it completely and absolutely was all day up and down stairs because of the air raid siren. We went upstairs. We no sooner got upstairs than you came down again. You went upstairs and then you came down again. And then we got to Cannon Street Station just after 5 to come home. Found we got a train to London Bridge and we couldn't get any further. So we walked it. So that night I walked from London Bridge to Catford. I was home in Waters Road when the bombs were dropped on the school. We saw the planes come over, which of course came from Biggin Hill Way, not much higher than rooftop. My sister dashed out into the garden and said, "Bring the baby in," because my niece Margaret was out there in the pram. She brought the baby in. I dived under the kitchen table, and then we heard thump, thump. And that was when they dropped the bombs on the school. And I understand that I don't live on the estate then, but we understand that the church hall was used as a temporary morgue, and the then caretaker spent all night with the children in the church hall. We did have a bomb at New Cross that landed on Woolworths. Quite a lot of people were killed that day because they just had a delivery of saucepans in, and we couldn't get saucepans for love or money. So anybody who was able went to Woolworths at New Cross, and unfortunately they got bombed. V2s, of course, you never saw. It was just suddenly bang, and the house had disappeared. V1s would come over. They would look just like the planes you see very, very high up, just a pair of wings and a body. But they had a sort of blazing tail. And once you saw that light go out and the noise stopped, you had to wait a few seconds before you got a bang, but they were just indiscriminate where they landed. I was called up in 1944. I did my initial training in Leicester. Then I was sent to the signals in Edinburgh, and we were in signal school. I was in signal school when actually war was declared over in May. Then from then on I just travelled Scotland. A friend of mine belonged to a jazz club, and she met various people at the jazz club, and they always met in the Northover pub on a Saturday evening, and they would sit and have a drink and talk, because on the Friday night they'd been to the jazz club. We met quite a lot of people there, and she asked me to go along. I went along and met my husband there, joined the jazz club, which meant we went to various pubs all over the borough, which had a room in which had a piano. So we met Humphrey Lyttelton there. Humphrey Lyttelton used to come along quite often and play. He forgot that in his memoirs. But that was right at the start of his career. And there was also a cartoonist from, I think it was the Daily Mail, and he used to play piano and I can't for the life of him remember his name. But I can see him now coming into the room, and the first thing he did was take the lid off the piano and the front off the piano, and then he would sit down and play it. My husband, he was a bricklayer. He'd gone to the Brixton School of Building, and he worked for McAlpines at one time. He worked quite locally. He did a lot of the flats that are in Bromley Road. He helped build those. And at one time, when he was just a bricklayer, the foreman came round and asked if anybody could do a particular bond. And he said, I can. And he was asked to build a wall in this particular bond, which he did. And from then he was made charge hand, and he eventually finished up as a clerk of the works, working for GLC. That was when the GLC used to build housing. This photograph, it's of Torridon Road actually, and it's taken from not far from where I live. It would be about 1910, 1912, something like that, looking at the children's clothes, which are quite Edwardian. The little girl especially, and she's got a frilly dress on. That is typically something that one of my uncles would have worn when he was a baby. Some things probably were better in the old days because when I was growing up, we had the splendid cinema. We had the Gaumont at Lewisham. And when it was built, that was the biggest Gaumont in the country. They had a beautiful tea room up there where you could have tea. When I first went to the Gaumont, which was soon after it was opened, I was bought a cup of tea, a teapot, milk and sugar on a tray during the interval. Oh, everybody would be aghast at the price of my house now. My house cost £2,100 in 1960. We moved into it because we happened to know the people who were vacating it, and we asked if we could have it before it even went on sale, and she said yes, and we got everything done and moved in. But housing at that time in 1959-60 was absolutely, you could not get it. If you managed to get a house, you were very lucky. If you went onto the council housing list, you were very, very, very lucky to even be offered a flat. You just could not get housing. And it wasn't because you couldn't afford it, it was because it wasn't available. They were still building then. Once upon a time, I could put my head out of the door at 10 o'clock in the evening, and the air was very, very sweet to breathe. You could really smell the air. Nowadays I can't. That is due to traffic. That is more pollution. Our local shops have all changed. Where the chemist is, we had the chemist. That's always been there. But next door to the chemist, we had a butcher's. I can't remember what was next door to that, but we had a South Suburban cooperative on the last two shops. The other side, we had where the one that is closed at the moment, that was a baker's. That was part of Southern's Bakers, who are at the bottom of Bellingham Road. And then we had a greengrocer, and we had a sweet shop, and we had what we called the oil shop, which was someone who sold paraffin and screws and nuts and bolts, you name it, they had it. Round the corner in Ardgowan Road, we had a little haberdasher's run by two little ladies. We also had another shop that did groceries. And the post office, of course. But all of those have changed. My first son was born in 1959, and we moved here when he was about 16 months old, I think it was. They went to Torridon Road School and then went off to Addie School, and then Simeon did quite well in his A-levels, and he was accepted into Heriot Watt University in Edinburgh. My other son, I coerced him into going to apply at Goldsmiths for an IT course. He's very, very clever at IT. They're both very clever at IT. They're the ones who taught me to do computers and what have you, but not a mobile, a smartphone. That defeats me completely. I've been in St Andrew's Church since about 1968. I've served on the PCC. I also did the flowers for about 50 years. I've just recently retired from those, and I still do the silver. I clean the cross, the candlesticks, and the silver that is used on the altar, the chalice and what have you. I suppose different vicars have different ideas as to what to do. We're a little bit more, I'll say, high church than we used to be, but that is entirely up to the vicar. I'm thankful that I've still got a pair of legs that walk. They don't like to do it much before 10:30 in the morning, but they eventually get there. I feel very, very sad of the people I know who've got dementia, who can't remember what they're doing or who they were or who somebody else is. That must be terrible to live with. My only regret is that I didn't become a nurse. But then circumstances were against working class girls becoming nurses. You had to have a certain level of education. And leaving school at 14, I didn't have that level of education. We went to brownies, or we went to guides, or you helped with guides or scouts. You sang, played golf. We were just people. Nobody worried whether you'd got any more money than anybody else, or you might be aghast at saying, "You've got 10 kids? Don't you know how to stop them?" But apart from that, no, I don't think anybody really worried as to whether you were black or white or whether you spoke English. I'd just say sort of thank you every day I wake up.